Hi, a very good afternoon to you all, and welcome to today's Westminster Property Association webinar. My name is Grace Packard. I'm a principal consultant at Momentum Transport Consultancy and also part of the WPA Next Gen Committee. I have the privilege of chairing this webinar today, which will focus on the Infrastructure Coordination Service, which was launched last year by the Westminster City Council in collaboration with the Greater London Authority. The scheme is designed to ensure that Westminster developments stitch very neatly into the local infrastructure networks, avoiding disruption through the planning and delivery stages, and enabling construction projects to progress more swiftly and cost efficiently. I like to think of it as very much like a large jigsaw puzzle, and we all want to benefit from the satisfying feeling of slotting those pieces very neatly into the wider area. Our webinar today will be a more technical webinar. So we'll be talking about the service itself, the overarching approach, the tools, and the practical realities. Whilst we won't be going into planning matters, we will be discussing where we go next and what is needed from you. To do that, I am pleased to be joined today by Nicola Coppin, Infrastructure Coordinator at Westminster City Council, Kevin Goad, the Director of City Highways at Westminster City Council, and from the Greater London Authority, we'll have Molly Strauss, the Head of Infrastructure, alongside Coach Carr, the Development Lead in the Infrastructure Coordination there. So to start, we'll hear from Molly and Nicola, who will be presenting more about the service. Following that, we'll have Kevin and Coach, who will join us to answer your questions. And on that note, if you'd like to ask anything, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom. So that's enough from me. And first, I'll hand over to Molly to introduce us to the service. Thanks, Molly.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, that's going to be the wrong one. Hold on. Always a fun exercise to do that well. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. So I'm Molly Strauss, Head of Infrastructure at the GLA. And I want to tell you a little bit about our Infrastructure Coordination Service, which encapsulates three different service lines, one of which is our development service that we'll be focusing on today. Just to give you a quick overview of why we have established an Infrastructure Coordination Service in London, there was an understanding across the industry that we would benefit from a sort of neutral convener in place to overcome some of the challenges around the fragmentation in the sector. We know that developers, that utilities and others work really hard to deliver on time and efficiently, but that there are some silos that are nobody's fault, but just a part of the sector that could benefit from convening. And so the Mayor's London Infrastructure Group, which the Mayor chairs and is a collection of CEO level representatives from all of London's major utilities, the development sector, et cetera, called on the GLA to form a new service. And in order to sort of support these priorities of the Mayor around reducing disruption on the road network, enabling housing delivery, supporting healthy streets and good growth. So we formed 2 years ago the sort of pilot version of our coordination service. We now, we originally received nearly £3 million from TfL's Lane Rental Surplus Fund, a grant to the GLA to fund the service. And we're now nearing the end of our second year of that initial phase and moving into a second phase, which we call the expansion phase, with another £3.5 million of funding to support us. And the coverage of the service along these different service lines varies, but you can see in our pilot that we targeted particular boroughs around particular services. And the ambition is to grow this across London over time. And I should say that while we are entering our second phase of work, coming up for 2 years, there's every ambition to scale this into a sustainable long-term offer in London across all 32+1 authorities. So the three service lines that we have within the ICS are planning, development, and streets. Today, we're going to focus in depth on development, so I'm not going to sort of steal Nick's thunder and talk to you too much about that. But the other two service lines, the planning service focuses on anticipating areas where there will be high levels of growth we expect, and thinking through the infrastructure needs of those areas in advance and proactively planning for them and implementing changes to the networks to support that development so that you don't arrive in a situation where, for instance, the Isle of Dogs is expected to see, in Tower Hamlets, is expected to see 40,000 new homes by 2031. And that's a massive, change in that area. And so we need to proactively plan to address the water, sewage, et cetera, electricity challenges in that area. The street service is a bit different. It's all around coordinating collaborative street works. So bringing together different utilities, developers in some cases, TfL and others to dig up the road once rather than one after the other, achieving disruption benefits and air quality benefits to Londoners, and also savings for those works promoters who can share costs with one another. As I said, the development service, I'll leave mostly to Nick, but the headline there is that we've parachuted a developer coordinator into 5 boroughs across London to aid developers in connecting into utilities and to do other services as well that Nick will get into. And the ambition there is to scale that as well so that we have a consistent offer across London. I'll quickly wrap up just to say, as I mentioned, that we have every anticipation that this will be a sort of ongoing part of London, our infrastructure coordination service, with a full service offer in place in time. As I said, we're sort of scaling up in a pilot to expansion to finally pan London. So bear with us as we do that. One really important final point to land on is that we rely on digital tools in order to aid our work programs across the board. We have 2 that we work with. One is the infrastructure mapping application, which we developed ourselves and manage. The other is the National Underground Asset Register, which is still in its pilot phase, but we are sort of instrumental in getting off the ground and testing in order to see how it might be of use in this sector. And I know Nick will touch on how she's using some of those tools in her work. So I'll leave it there for the moment and hand it over to Grace, I suppose, to hand back to Nick, I expect, and here to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you, Molly. That was fantastic. That was a really great, succinct summary of the service there. So yes, Nick, over to you so we can start stepping into the world of Westminster.
Just let me know that you can see that. That would be brilliant.
Yeah, we can see.
Fabulous. Okay, so thank you, Molly, for doing the initial groundwork bits. The challenge, as Molly did explain, was really about better support with complex processes for infrastructure and the developments themselves, trying to partner the two and make things a lot better. And as you can see, research with London developers found that 79% have experienced disruption as a result of connecting to the utilities network. They say their investments have significantly been disrupted, 45% of them. Sorry, I just want to move my step. 62% have had unforeseen costs from utilities disruption, and 98% say that the disruption had caused delays to their projects. So, ultimately this has given the utilities and infrastructure sector a negative reputation, and it's something that I really want to change, because actually I think with the word coordination, as in infrastructure coordination, we can make a huge difference. And it doesn't really take a lot to be able to do some positives. So how we can help. So infrastructure coordinators offer technical infrastructure expertise and local stakeholder knowledge required to proactively prepare for works and engage efficiently with utilities in the borough. What we look to do are to support people pre-application process for planning permissions, as well as being able to maybe identify help before something becomes a potential project. We can help there. But obviously the main elements are, as a project is going to get ready to go through the planning process, and being able to understand more about what that site has, what's around it, and in particular the ability for myself as an infrastructure coordinator to really draw on what's happening across the borough, and being able to identify maybe adjacent projects that could actually have some elements that cross over and therefore make an impact positively on both of those developments. obviously we're here also to be able to support going through the delivery process, and the fact that I link a lot with various departments within Westminster City Council and with the infrastructure, utilities and transport organisations means that hopefully there's a one-point contact for various things that can also assist with that going through that construction phase and unlocking some of the things that we, might not have even anticipated happen. So I've just put this slide in because it's a really handy way of showing how we support the delivery and the pre-planning by the fact that we've got things, as Molly described, about the data innovation tools, the National Underground Asset Register and the infrastructure mapping application. I'll show you a little example later on of where that's being used. We've got a different set of contacts. So where projects are dealing on a project-to-project basis within the infrastructure organisations, we've actually got an ability to go in at a slightly different level if it's required to find out information, or actually to support both the utility and the project. So this isn't about sort of, it is really that coordination and collaboration that's key. The local knowledge is something that's actually quite key for this. And it can be anything from just sort of being aware of issues that are happening to where we've seen with COVID, the fact that we've had to adjust roads and, divert traffic and things like that. Now, hopefully going forward, that's not going to be needed because hopefully with the COVID scenario going, but there are lots of other ways in which that kind of linchpin of information and fielding can actually assist projects. So you can see there, the slide, and I'm sure these will be available later, so I don't want to take you through everything, but it's definitely that outcomes for the client that I focus on. And, I'm sure you are as well, because particularly the reduced risk of disruption is just so important because we've got a city that it just never stops. It's always regenerating itself in one way or another, and not least now with the COVID scenario. So who am I to do all of this? Well, I have got extensive project management experience in the utilities world, having worked with both UK Power Networks, Thames Water. I've also worked on rail projects, and my sort of big one, my sort of real pleasure to achieve was getting electricity for the Ebbsfleet Garden City. So that's just my slide that just shows, I have got some credentials behind me that are not just about the experience, but also a strategic look, which is exactly what I bring to Westminster. So these are coming into just a couple of examples. The first one is about legal assistance. So there's a project and the works were actually stalled because a utility cable was found at a site that's going to be regenerated. This discovery was found around about 2019, late 2019, and the legal review process for the way in which that cable would be investigated showed that there would be cost penalties if it was a live utility that then caused someone to go offline. So the task that I was set, which was in December 2020, so this has been discussion, there's a timeline of communication up to the point of me coming in, which I pieced together. And actually what I worked out really quickly was that it was a kind of translation piece between a legal team and the actual utility organisation, and not quite getting, the same understanding across. They've both got their own jargon, and some of that jargon, same word, different meaning. So I was able to pull that together and look at that. Plus, with my background, I was able to start looking at the ways we could unlock it and explain in nice, easy ways how the blockage could be unblocked. And really, it was a case of not just identifying what the procedure was, but it was actually more about the fact that there were liabilities and needing that to be understood fully by Westminster before they could sign on the dotted line to commence works. The result was that, we were able to clarify between us exactly what next steps would be, so that if that cable was found to be operational, then actually we would have this and this in place to be able to do as the backup, so that hopefully it wouldn't impact as badly on the programme as actually getting to that point had kind of caused. So next one is a permanent power supply for temporary work. So I'm sure that you've all seen the Marble Arch viewing platform that's been being constructed to enjoy another view of London, and from quite an amazing area, I would say. The platform itself actually will have lift access for people. It also has pedestrian access, and then it has the facilities requirements for the temporary structure, so lighting and things like that. And the task there was to looking at how we could get power for the Marble Arch viewing platform by June 2021. Now, the declaration of climate emergency for Westminster pulled this together in terms of trying to avoid the need of generators. So what did we do? Well, we assessed an old quotation that we'd been given, and we were given a new quotation, and we were reviewing it. And what we noted was that there wasn't consideration of the at-pace requirement for energisation if it was going to be used for that viewing platform. So it's very, very quickly we were able to establish that maybe a permanent supply, when taking into account landowner permissions, design timescales, even things like getting the cable there and having maybe road closures, would actually, formulate a cost prohibitive project. But that during the works for the viewing platform, even though it may well be using the generators, we can still gather information, we can talk to people and get our stakeholders in line for consideration of a potential permanent supply at a later date, which would mean that that area could actually end up with other events happening and not having to have their generators. So we reviewed the quotation for the energy, we took the pressure off of the timescales in doing this, and we were able to obviously reduce costs, because if we would have gone for that initially, it would have been very, very expensive. But also we're looking at the ways in which that could still be delivered. So it's really a case of being able to do like every project manager would love, and actually have the time for assessing what could happen and where the value for money could be. My final one is use of the data tools and in asset identification. So there are areas identified during the COVID scenario and for potential regeneration in the future that Westminster have been formulating. And one of the best ways of just getting initial, not expensive information on an area is just to go and contact me to find out about what stakeholders are actually present at that particular location. So it may be the landowner, it could be which assets are in the ground, it can be where we're looking to do meanwhile use, is there something that's in the ground that will actually prohibit doing it because of maybe access for emergency or anything like that. So using the online data mapping tools, all those asset owners can be assessed, landowners are assessed, and then we've got a nice way of starting up the real consideration for a project and bearing in mind the timescales for various permissions and notices. It means we've got that time to be able to gather our stakeholders and plan that project. As a result, the early review of sites meant that there are some areas that will have to remain sterilised. They are not considered to be possible. And then there are others that are not available at the moment, but could become available for the future. So just to recap, we've got borough expertise, we've got the GLA network behind us, and utility company access. And we believe that this is a very long-term value. The cost of the service is £100 per hour in Westminster plus VAT. And I think you might find it a bit hard pushed to find somewhere, offering that for such a reasonable amount. And the other pioneering boroughs, there are Redbridge, Tower Hamlets, Croydon and Lambeth, and we're all doing, the same work. We're all infrastructure coordinators, and each of us have got additional sort of specialisations that we can draw on each other just as much as we may know information ourselves. Thank you very much. Look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And I will do that. I'll dive straight into questions. And still on the topic of Westminster, Kevin, if I can come to you first, please. How do you think the service itself links in with your team's work, and how does it complement it?
Right. I think people on the call will be pleased to hear that the role sits within my team. So it's not another part of the organisation. I think one of the challenges we always have at Westminster is showing there's one front door to get your services, your request addressed. So Nicola sits in the highways planning team, which sits in the highways directorate alongside the public realm schemes. And we have a major role at Westminster, as you all know, in terms of coordinating physical public realm works and utilities activities, because we are the permitting authority as well. I think what I would say is that the benefits of having that team within our group is that we are heavily involved in all major infrastructure discussions, particularly at the pre-planning stage. And I'm not going to get into planning conversations as we touched on earlier. So we're all very much aligned in that respect. And I think what this brings to the table is an opportunity to not just actually have those early conversations about what utility needs are linked to a particular development, whether they're temporary supply, permanent supply, or even as is often the case in Westminster, diversions. By having it within the highways group, we also then look across the piece in terms of what else is going on in the area that may then have a fundamental impact on a developer's ability to make the connections in a particular window of time. So Nicola quoted to you earlier the example around a very high voltage cable was found lying across the site that we didn't know was there, and we spent a lot of time actually getting UK Power Networks onto the ground to address that and time the permanent connection to that. And it was one of Westminster's own developments to align with the time the development was coming out of the ground and then needed that permanent supply in. At the same time, because this is in South Westminster, we are also very conscious and aware that we had Cadent Gas doing major Victoria Main infrastructure changes in the area. So that allowed us to ensure that whilst we couldn't change the delivery window on the supply for the site itself, we could coordinate effectively the traffic management. So we limited disruption of having two major infrastructure schemes open on a very busy part of town.
Thanks, Kevin. And with that, if we're stepping forward to the future, can you tell us a little bit about some key developments that might be coming forward, or perhaps some infrastructure projects coming forward in Westminster?
I was thinking about that, Grace, when you asked me earlier. There are 695 open sites at Westminster, development sites in Westminster at the moment. That's just physical buildings. That's nothing to do with highways works. So trying to pick one or two out of that is hugely challenging. But I think, we have our own, we have the Grosvenor Place, the Grosvenor Square, the hotel developments, which is significant, particularly off the West Halkin Road, where, the utilities work there was actually to terminate the supply to get the project underway, and resulted in something like 6 or 7 substations being installed. These are generators installed on the carriageway to facilitate power to the area whilst the development firstly went down and then came out of the ground. Our own 2 sites, Ebury and Church Street, have had major infrastructure developments associated with them. The Lisson Arches project to divert all the utilities in the area in Church Street, and obviously the power supply challenge, which Nicola was referring to on Ebury. The thing for me, and it's probably a further question from you, is that this service gives that read across. This service allows you to pull the right levers at the right time. And I think one of the challenges that we've always had from the development industry is, and it's not a criticism, it's we need to occupy in 2 weeks' time. Can you help us get the power supply in? Or can you help us do this or that? And the answer is often, well, no, because there's too much going on. And when you have some sites that are operating at 400,000 plus a day, that's not practical or desirable for the developer. So that early doors engagement, that early doors ability to actually plan your needs for utility infrastructure, to coordinate what can be at times significant pieces of work, is what this is all about. I'm not going to touch on planning, but if we could condition formal plans as part of a planning approval in terms of when utilities come on stream, that will be absolutely great. The other thing for me about this is it's the ability and the desire to work with developers to think a bit more rationally or logically about how you make those connections to sites, particularly from a highways perspective. And I'll just give you an example very close to home, because it's next door to City Hall and Victoria Street. The Zigzag building. A lovely building, a great mix of high-end residential, some retail at the bottom, and the road was opened about 40 times to make connections for various things. Now, in this role, I think one of the opportunities is to think about how can you design or change the configuration of the highway or the footway to ensure that when you want to make these utility connections, whether they're power or cable or anything else, you don't result in digging the road up every 5 minutes. The solution in Victoria Street would have been to have 4 or 5 hatches, and then actually just lift the hatch and make a connection. So that's what we're really looking for. Simple solutions that work, minimize future disruption, but get the utility connections delivered to the developers in a timely fashion, and so they can complete the works as quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good way to think about it from my point of view is the fact that Westminster itself is a machine. And this machine is made up of many, many, many different cogs that ultimately somehow have to work together. And I think this service provides very much a coordination of knowledge. And we need that knowledge to make sure that the right decisions are made and that we can be proactive about getting our infrastructure in place and these developments built effectively.
Absolutely.
Coach, I'm going to move over to you. Hi, Coach. I think can you tell us a little bit about the future plans for the service? Because I know it's been in operation for a couple of years now. So where do you see the service going in the future?
Thanks very much. I think as Molly and Nick have both pointed out, we've been going for 2 years now, and the service has been available through Westminster, but also through the 4 other boroughs that were set out. Going forward, obviously, the first thing we're looking at is bringing more projects in, and especially with Westminster, getting more and more work through Nick. But I think going forward over the next few years, having more work across London is really key. And having the service right now, we are available over London, but having infrastructure coordinators set out in each of the different boroughs is definitely ambition for us over the next few years.
Brilliant. And I think, yes, you said that you've been going for a couple of years. Molly or Coach yourself, have you talked about what the key challenges or indeed opportunities that have been across London that you've found so far, and what you've unearthed during the 2 years that it's been going so far?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So across the whole infrastructure coordination service, so that includes development, which Nick and Coach are key to, and planning and streets. One of the big challenges, and the reason why the service was created in part, is that there's so many different approaches across London, across the 32+1 authorities, across the different utility companies, and unlocking opportunities for coordination requires finding the right people deep within those organizations, making sure that they have access to the data and information that they need. So there's been a massive push around data sharing that has facilitated this work. And it wasn't until we were able to unlock that data sharing that, for instance, in the streets area of work, we were able to identify where we could do collaborative street works much more effectively. Before that, we were guessing about where different works might be able to overlap and accelerate. But once we had sight of that information, we could target ourselves much more strategically. And similarly, I think, in the development service, kind of finding the right coordinators who we now have in our 5 different boroughs where we're piloting this, and making sure that those folks have all the right contacts within the borough, embedded fully in their borough, which Nick absolutely is, as Kevin has helpfully pointed out, in terms of his team, and also that they have the inroads into telecoms, utilities, and others who, TfL, et cetera, who they need access to in order to make this work. I think those have been some of the big challenges that we've fortunately, overcome in the pilot stage, to the point where I think now we have that understanding, and the coordinators themselves are able to draw on that knowledge and those contacts to make a big difference, hopefully, to their clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, moving on from that point slightly, we've had a question come through. And Molly, if we could stay with you on this, could the service be used to underpin master planning and future asset planning? And most importantly, how will this help landowners, utility companies, and the city to achieve net zero?
Good, great questions. I think that Coach can also answer the question about master planning. So I think this has come up recently, in certain contexts with larger scale development. I think absolutely the service can be used at really any stage of the process. It's important to kind of point out that we also have our planning service at the GLA, which thinks even earlier than the master planning stage about the impact to an area of lots of growth coming there. So if you're thinking about, if you're a local authority thinking about how to manage growth and how to facilitate that growth at a big scale and the different infrastructure requirements needed, that would sit within our planning service, where we're kind of having that big conversation. But if you're thinking about how to think through utilities and telecoms, et cetera, at the master planning stage of a site, then 100%, I think the services that Nick has in place would be helpful for that, and should be considered. In terms of the net zero point, all of this work falls within the mayor's sort of priorities around a Green New Deal to assist with COVID recovery, and an ambition for net zero by 2030 for London. And our view and the sort of logic underpinning all of these services is that when you proactively plan and you are more efficient, you reduce emissions across the board, you reduce traffic on the road network because you've reduced disruption, and you reduce the need to retrofit retroactively, to go back in and fix something that you haven't done properly the first time. And so all of that, has climate benefits. Also, there's opportunities to look at innovative technologies in all of these services. We're really focused in our street service on sustainable drainage and incorporating that into streets, and that has climate benefits and adaptation benefits. And finally, I think there's a sort of additional benefit here around unlocking development in homes, which isn't a climate benefit per se, but is critical for London to thrive and to have the right homes for its residents. So it's important to see how that benefit comes out as well.
Absolutely. I wondered, Nicola, would you like to jump in there and add anything at all?
Yeah, sure. What I was going to say, actually, I was going to be typing an answer, And I was going to say that net zero is something that's really high on my agenda. And if you look at the ways in which the infrastructure companies themselves are innovating to incorporate, you know, the sort of reduction of the carbon footprint, looking at embodied carbon and things like that, you know, every aspect of life needs to consider it. And where I offer a strategic view is handy for things like understanding with the teams within Westminster where they're trying to do consolidated deliveries, or where there are areas that when you're redesigning, you're designing out the sort of bad practice and bringing in the best practice. So there's all different ways in which that net zero gets considered, although it's not necessarily in its own little pocket of we've got to do this because it's net zero. You're always doing things because of, you know, making the borough as it should be for our residents and the community that use it.
Absolutely, yeah. The net zero challenge is a very big goal that we're all striving to get to. What do you think, Nicola, are the other key infrastructure challenges in Westminster at the moment?
I mean, you've only got to look at the statistics to know how busy the planning permission department, you know, the planning team work because of various, you know, high applications coming in. There's also been, over the last year with COVID, there's been a lot of change to the use of, you know, roads as outdoor areas for restaurants and cafes and things like that. And really it's about getting that cohesion between the what has been in the last year that has been so unprecedented, no one really thought about, and then obviously making that benefit for the future that does incorporate some of the things that we've had to think about in the last year. I think that there's also ways in which now we are looking at people as individuals, we're looking at organisations as collaborating with one another, and that really is the key to anything that goes on in any borough, but particularly at Westminster, with being so built up with, you know, all the different aspects that come into Westminster, from, you know, the Parliament right the way through to tourism. You know, we do need to make sure that we're smarter.
Absolutely. And Kosh, in your experience from a sort of wider London point of view, would you suggest there are any other infrastructure challenges that we've seen elsewhere, perhaps haven't come up in Westminster just yet, but may well affect it in the future?
Yeah, well, I'll actually harks back to, I was going to go back to the master planning question and that element of it. So there's a few areas around London that we're aware of that's kind of large master plans going on, for example, around Old Kent Road and through Croydon, Earls Court. And the presentation Nick gave, the scope that's set out there is a really kind of great approach that we have to individual developments, but something like a master plan that is happening in various parts of London, that's almost the epitome of how this service can be used to the greatest benefit. And that really is kind of how we think we can do the greatest good, really, because as Kevin said, you know, there was that one development which the road got lifted up 40 times. Imagine that over a huge hectare development site with many different developers owning different sections of it, and it being phased over 5, 10, 12 years. This kind of forward-thinking, coordinated view that Nick's been pioneering through can really save a huge amount of time and cost and disruption to the public over a really long term. That said, the other thing I was going to mention briefly was that everything that we've set out so far, as Molly said, is kind of like a pilot phase, and this is kind of the results that have come out from us. But if there are any other challenges that anyone on the call or developers that you know of, you think that we could be helping with, please do get in touch, and it's stuff that we can develop going forward for sure.
Fantastic. I'm just conscious of the time. We are due to close at 1:45. Kevin, one final question for yourself. What do you think is key to a successful in Westminster? I know there's probably many answers to that.
Not having a pandemic would help. I think just playing back to Nicola's point in your earlier question first, Grace, on the challenges. There's two challenges in Westminster: backlog. A lot of utilities down tools needed emergencies only during the last 12 months. So we have a massive backlog coordination to deliver. And the big point for me, and it comes back to Scott's question around zero and everything, it's future proofing. We need to ensure that the utilities work that's undertaken on a development site is thinking beyond the development site itself. And I'll just quote the Leicester Square example. The Leicester Square at the moment has massive works going on in terms of the replacement of the 3 principal transformers in a 30-metre hole just where the ticket office is in front of the hotel. That infrastructure was designed to last 50 years. It lasted less than 30 because of demand for the services coming out. So we're now replacing 3 massive transformers, which hopefully will give 50 to 70 years worth of power requirements that the city needs. So it's about future proofing. It's about providing utilities connections. This isn't just thinking about the single location, it's about the bigger picture. But in terms of getting this right and what we'll need to do, it is ensuring that when you come forward with your development ideas, you really do have a view about the timing and the window from commencement. I accept that commencement planning is one part of the process. Commencement is a different issue and depends on all the different circumstances. But once you get into the ground, it's really about ensuring that we have aligned your needs to get your utilities delivered, that we can join the dots up, think about the future, think about long-term provision, and ensure that we minimise disruption. And going back to the carbon neutral point, we meet with the utilities at a chief exec level every quarter, and that's the cabinet member and myself. And we've already shared our experience around a 50% reduction in carbon impact of roadworks and the King Street model. And we're sharing best practice. We're also sharing plans so that we understand the pressures and challenges of each of the utilities, so we can align our activities to fit alongside developments, roadworks, and other things that emerge in the city.
Fantastic. And Nicola, final question for you. Can you just remind us as to how our members can find out more and make use of the service?
Yeah, certainly. So it's direct to me, and my email is ncoppin, which is COPPE for Echo, N for November, at westminster.gov.uk. And I also have a mobile, which is 07855 146 746,